Box Dance presents.
Hello and welcome back to Dance Behind the Screen podcast. We're your co-host, Azaria.
Hi, Reyna.
It's Marthea.
And today our mini-series is Social Injustice, Black Lives Matter, and Dance.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to talk to both of you about how this came about and our two guests that we have so far on our podcast. I think we have some really good information coming.
Yeah, so to talk about how this began, it was, I still remember June 6th. My husband and I had gone up early to go get breakfast, and I was just really overwhelmed with everything that was happening. And I just kept thinking, how can I protest? How can I be active in this current time? And so I called Azaria and I said, hey, I pitched the idea and I was like, what do you think about it? And do you want to talk about that, Azaria?
Yeah, so I probably wasn't that honest up front, but I was actually kind of hesitant when you brought it up. I was exhausted, and this news is just re-traumatizing, and it's not something new. But I think it was just the breaking point. I happened to have been at home in Georgia when Aubrey was shot down, so I was already processing that. And then I came home, and then it was George Floyd. So I think I needed time to process. I knew that we needed to use our platform and to speak out and to help educate others. But for me personally, I was overwhelmed.
Yeah, and I think it was, we talked about it a little bit, and then we discussed the different people that we could interview. And once we talked a little bit more of that, we pitched the idea to Marthea and Yejin, who were also looking of ways to be active during the Black Lives Matter movement. And then from there, it just kind of grew.
Yeah, I think we were trying to figure out, how can we use this platform, a digital dance company, to really support the people that need support, and also to use our platform to educate the dance community on what's going on or what has been going on, so we could have more discussions about racism specifically in the United States and how it's impacting the dance world, and how, us as individuals, what can we do to fight racism and to make sure that it's not just one of those things that we're glossing over. It's not just a trend on social media.
Right.
Grad school together. Teaching is, what we do. And I know, Zari, you actually posted that on Facebook when you started sharing your resources. You've shared one every day for the past month. But it's how can we use our skill as teachers to actually teach people? But I think in this instance, it's not really my responsibility or Yejin's responsibility to be teaching, but rather how can we come together to use our platform to have teachers on. And so it's been a real honor to actually get to have some of our guests on our show to talk about their experience with racism and what we can do to move forward. And I think, that's just something that's super important to all of us here at No Box. We have the roundtable conversation to talk about COVID-19, specifically, what the dance community is doing in response to COVID-19 and in preparation for this pandemic that we don't really have an end date for. So I think, what we're grateful for and what we're so privileged to have is the dance community to lean on. And so we can use that kind of as our community to have these conversations about what's going on.
Yeah, I want to go back a little bit, and yes, it is important to go to the people who've been doing the research. But I do think it's everyone's responsibility to be active in how they learn and engage and are seeking out information. And that's part of what I want to help offer and make it easier, because it is everyone's responsibility to educate themselves.
Right.
But at the same time, I still realize that many people don't even realize they've been miseducated. We know that we have textbooks that just gloss over any type of civil rights or civil war or Black history. And so many people don't even realize that they need to be educated. So while, yes, we are bringing on other people to teach, it is still your responsibility to open up your heart and educate yourself.
Right.
Yeah, and I think too, like, it's uncomfortable, you know. As a white woman, this has been uncomfortable for me to realize my experience and my racist experiences in the past. And I think that, you know, we're hoping that we can be examples of what we hope to see for the future, specifically, you know, in the dance world and with the world at large. Like, how can we use social media to educate ourselves? Like you're saying, Azaria, you know, we can curate the content that we want to consume. So how can we choose what we look at every day on Instagram or on Facebook to actually be getting information that's the correct information and the right sources? And I think that's part of, you know, why we want to have these guests on our show to talk about this, so they can kind of also help those who maybe didn't realize, but help kind of navigate all of the flux and overstimulus of information that is surfacing right now.
Yeah. And I think that one of the key elements to all of this, which I think we've all mentioned at some point, and our audience, you will all hear through our interviews, is that listening has to take a big part in this. Doing a lot of deep listening. And I think Paloma mentions it at the very beginning of the podcast, as Tim also mentions it through the podcast as well. So,
and we want to have a little bit more of a conversation about racism, but we feel like we can't move forward until we honor those who have been affected and those who have died because of police brutality. So we wanted to invite you guys to join us in taking a moment of silence after we say the names of those who have died because of police brutality in the United States.
George Floyd.
Breonna Taylor.
Atiana Jefferson.
Ara Roser.
Stephon Clark.
Botham Jean.
Philando Castile.
Alton Sterling.
Michelle Cusseau.
Freddie Gray.
Tanisha Fonville.
Eric Garner.
Akai Gurley.
Gabriela Nevades.
Tamir Rice.
Michael Brown.
Tanisha Anderson.
So again, we just want to invite you all to take a moment of silence in memory of those we have lost to police brutality, and those names that we haven't named. Thank you.
So today for part one, as we said, we got to speak to the wonderful, fabulous Paloma McGregor.
Yeah, a little bit about Paloma. She is the director of Angelus Pole's Dancing While Black. She's a Caribbean-born, New York-based choreographer and arts leader. McGregor has spent more than a decade centering Black voices through collaborative, community-specific performance projects. It was an honor to speak to her. Like I said earlier, one of the first things that she mentions in our conversations is deep listening. And then another thing that really struck me that she said was, darkness has a lot to teach us. And I think that was a point where everything was turned for me, and I was like 100% yes.
I have to say, I'm so jealous that you guys got to speak with her. I've just been corresponding with her through email, but I'm wondering what she said about the deep listening. How have you guys, I guess, brought that into your own life? Because you both keep talking about it, like every time, every day when we talk and we're texting.
I think my body knew that I needed to be doing it. I think I was doing it, but fighting against it. I think the first week, I didn't respond a lot. And I think instead of taking that as an opportunity to deep listen, I fought it for a long time. So I think for me, it just gives me permission. And I think I felt it inherently that everything that was happening was really reactionary. And reaction is brief, right? And so I didn't want to just react. I wanted to be able to think and move forward. So I think her saying that gave me permission, like, oh, yes, that's right. I can do that.
I think for me, the idea of deep listening took different forms. I think specifically when going into, for example, Instagram and sharing different resources that people are putting up. I think there's one thing sharing a resource, and another thing is reading over the resource, informing yourself, really listening to what that resource has to say and sharing it. So I think for me, it was sort of this thing of like, don't just listen to somebody speaking, but also listen to what somebody's writing about the movement and how to move forward. So I think for me, it was in that way.
And that ties into her concept of, we don't necessarily have to strip everything down. There's people been doing this work for decades. Like, we need to shift our focus. She did this awesome hand gesture of her hands kind of switching positions to switch focus to the people who've been doing the work. So they're leaders. We just have to listen to them and stop thinking that we have to do everything from scratch or reinvent the wheel when people have dedicated their lives to this kind of work.
Yeah, I listened to y'all's conversation before we recorded this intro right now, and I just feel like those two concepts like are so directly related. Like, you have to be able to listen in order to see what people have been doing for 100+ years before, dealing with these issues. So I think that we hope that this conversation can just remind or refresh everybody's memory kind of on just the importance of just taking the time to pause, be still and listen. I know that's part of the reason we wanted to take the moment of silence on this episode today too, because there's so much power in pause. And I know it's been going around like COVID-19 is kind of the great pause. And I think that, that's something our whole world needs. And I mean, I for sure need it. Like, pause. I don't have the answers, just because we have Google doesn't mean we always have all the answers. Sometimes it takes that moment, that pause to actually look to other people so that we can actually better understand other perspectives in order to really truly connect with other human beings.
So we don't want to spoil too much for you. I hope you all enjoy this episode, but make sure that you follow Angela's Pulse and donate to them. They're already doing the work, so let's help support them continue doing the work.
Stay tuned.
Thanks. Hello, Paloma. It's great to have you with us today.
Nice to be with you all.
How have you been holding up?
Listen, it is such a time of great potential and born of great tragedy. And so I'm navigating and oscillating and finding people and movements and intimate gatherings as ways to, as a salve, as I think about all of what has forced us all to contend with this moment, and finding great gratitude and inspiration in people and communities and organizations who've been preparing for this moment for a long time, some for generations. And so, yeah, some days or some moments I find myself feeling quite sad about the histories that have brought us here, feeling rageful about the histories that have brought us here, and am constantly allowing that feeling to happen, and then also looking toward what Jawale Zahler the other day in a panel I saw her moderate called the light, looking toward the light. And sometimes the light, maybe it's, you find the light in actual darkness. So also looking toward what the darkness might teach us, as my dear colleague Amara Tabor Smith out of the Bay Area would say, the darkness also has a lot to teach us. So looking toward my teachers too, and my community for like wisdom that that I don't hold yet, and in elders, but also looking toward young people and this next generation. Like I'm this in-betweener. I turned 46 during the pandemic, and so it's quite an interesting position to be in the gray space between elder generation and so-called millennial, although I'm not sure that's language. I don't know if that's language that the people who are called millennials called themselves. So I say so-called millennial until y'all tell me what
I
you
know
really
there's like
think your name is.
specific dates. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
And I think the one after millennials is like Gen Z. I don't know. It's really confusing. One thing I do appreciate what you like emailed to us was that you needed to do some deep listening. And I think I really needed to hear that for myself, because I felt the deep need to do that too. And I think I was doing it, but not actively. So then I would go into this moment of silence, and then it would just be chaos. And it's just been a roller coaster. And just hearing like, oh, it is okay to like deep listen to see what to do, because I saw a lot of reactions, and that's like understandable, but I don't think that reactions are sustainable. And a lot of the reactions were angry, and they should be angry, and I'm not trying to judge the angry at all, but then at the same time I'm like, in the long goal, how do I help move us forward? And it was just like a up and down, and like sometimes I'm good, sometimes I like have to like take a nap in the middle of the day just because I am just so drained. So I like appreciate that sense of like deep listening is like necessary.
You know, I would say that my creative practice really taught me that. I feel like all of the work that I've been called to make has surfaced within me because I stopped long enough or asked enough questions that the seed kernel idea arrived. And for me, then that idea is not my idea alone. Like I feel as though there's like ancestral wisdom that if we're quiet enough and practice enough, there's things that bubble up inside of us that are generations of longing for. And this is a culture built on producing out of the labor of Black and brown bodies, out of genocide, And so the urgency, I feel the urgency deeply. And I also recognize that some of what I'm feeling is internalized stuff that I'm actually trying to let go of. Like, oh, well, I have to do this or that now in order, you know, I've been listening for what is my work to do in this moment. Like and how is my work and our work as the team of folks who I work closely with aligned with like broad work for change, for what in Emergent Strategy, the book by Adrienne Marie Brown, I wish I could name who said this. I really need to look back, but there's a notion in there, an idea in there that when people are doing the right work, the work that moves us closer to justice, that it's actually a turning, like we turn toward that work. The idea of kind of dismantling, oh, we're going to tear everything that we have down and then rebuild it, is quite actually a colonial imperialistic notion. Like, let's wipe away everything that's here and then rebuild something new. When in fact, people have been doing work, preparing for this moment for such time. So how do we turn our energies toward the visions that we want to manifest? And some of that turning requires protest, you know, I mean, like the turning is all of these practices, because protest and rage and all of that is also a generations long practice that has afforded us to be in this moment, all of us having technology to have this conversation, the three of us together in this moment in time, and feel free to say what we know.
Yeah, I feel like it's a spectrum, and I think all of the parts need to be there in order to make change. Like, we can't just have all the people who are like researchers, and we can't have all the people who are just protesters. I feel like all of us are serving a part of like this larger like clock work that's going on. So I do think that's important. I think it's also important that you brought up that many people have already been preparing and doing this work. So even for Angela's Pulse and Dancing While Black, what is some of the work that you all have been doing, and how can the community, the dance community in particular, steer and turn towards the work that you've all been doing already, so that we don't feel like we're having to tear down and start from scratch, because we actually don't have to start from scratch.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you know, Angela's Pulse was born out of a need to understand and name what my work might be, you know, after spending my early part of my 20s as a journalist at a daily newspaper in Cleveland, and then coming back to dance and moving to New York in the hopes of working for Urban Bush Women. And then when you know, I had interviewed Jawole a decade before as a young journalist. So a decade later, I'm auditioning for her. And when you sort of reach the end of that part of a journey, then you have to ask yourself, or I felt like I had to ask myself, oh, well, what am I supposed to do next? And Angela's Pulse was born out of that question, like, oh, what's next? And then out of that work of centering, like, what does it mean to be creating or shepherding or gathering or galvanizing creative communities to practice and experience and develop the ways that creative practice is embodied as visioning practice, as how you take vision and activate it and animate it. And I think that's one of the guiding forces in Angela's Pulse. And so Dancing While Black, which is one of the key initiatives that Angela's Pulse shepherds, was really born out of a sense, after having lived in New York, I guess I'd been there almost a decade. So it's this thing about decades too, like how long does it take for something new to evolve? So that's quite a pattern in my life, along with a pattern of like the FU moment where I'm like, oh, you think that that's the case? Well, FU, I'm going to show you. I mean, as like a generative force, like I have come to accept as I've gotten older that like, okay, that's a generative force. Like, how do I translate that energy into something that I can really hold on to, that's not just anger about the thing, but that develops into something productive. And so Dancing While Black really came out of a sense that like, oh, these white institutions really only have space for one of us in a residency or one of us, you know, in a season, or like, you know, I had experienced a platform that had been done sort of 30 years before. And I was thinking like, how amazing. And also really it took 30 years for this to happen again. And wondering what, as a person who'd started to get access to like, oh, I have a residency here. Oh, I have like through my leadership within Urban Bush Women have connected with these different networks of people. What could I do to change that, to like create a space where Blackness was at the center and open for other people to show up when it's public programming, but also very clear about like what will remain at the center, because things can get hijacked so easily, and the practice of the culture is to kind of hijack the thing of white culture. And so yeah, you name it, Dancing While Black, which, I mean, we're talking 2012, so just a few months before the very first Dancing While Black platform, where like it was birthed at the Bronx Academy of Arts and Dance, which is an institution that centers Blackness, queerness, womanhood, transness all the time in the Bronx, invited me to do something. And I said, oh, well, I've been thinking about this thing, Dancing While Black. And Urban Bush Women partnered with me. And so I pulled together this current generation of in the Urban Bush Women lineage to showcase work that comes out of a lineage, to also make clear, like, we don't, in a field where innovation is such a, so prized, that like innovation doesn't come without lineage. And that in fact, white folks who are dance makers benefit so much from their lineage. You know, when you have, I experienced early on in my time in New York that being a part of Urban Bush Women, in fact, and being in that lineage, that people were like, oh, well, is that too derivative of Urban Bush Women? But I don't know who's asking that of people who come out of, you know, a Martha Graham tradition, is that too derivative? Or a Trisha Brown tradition, is that too derivative? You know, so like contending with just what I was hearing, I was listening, what I was hearing, having some deep conversations with some colleagues. And so and then having it be in collaboration with amazing artist and organizer, Shani Jamila, who was working at the Urban Justice Center. So to align this notion of Dancing While Black and the field with larger concerns about Black-bodied people navigating anywhere, and what that might mean for people for whom the Black body is their visioning instrument. So what does it mean for your visioning instrument to also be a target of terror?
I think that is such an important thing to bring up too, because I think even for the Black community, it's so internalized. And I'm thankful that I had an elder to help like make me realize it, that I remember I didn't apply for a job because I thought to myself, oh, they already have someone who's doing Afro-diasporic work. And I remember it was Ogia Cruz-Banks. She said, that's like internalized racism right there, as if there's not room for more than one of us. And I think that is just how there's been just so much tokenism that it's like, even just realizing to like check it within ourselves, that we aren't like, well, like they've met their quota and like, yes. So I think that's so important too.
I'll also say it's not lost on me. Like, my mom is white. She was a union organizer and an art teacher, like a public school educator. She immigrated here from England in the 60s and lived in Boston when MLK was shot. Like, we have a lot of, but you know, it's not lost on me, I'll say. I name all those things because I think it's important to say that too. I spent the first 10 years of my life in the Caribbean, which is like Black community, and went to Florida A&M University for undergrad, which is also like a reconvening of, like, that was my reconvening of Black community, a historically Black college in Tallahassee, Florida. And it isn't, so with all those experiences and lineages, it's also not lost on me the great privilege as a light-skinned, potentially, depending on who's looking, white passing person to be able to sort of shout into the space things that might be heard differently from other people, or that might surprise people for me to say. Like, I've been in enough circumstances where my histories or my lineages or my ties to community have been mistaken, where I get to hear people's sort of inner monologue out loud. And so I, you know, yeah. So I also feel like then given all of that, given that I know that that I have privileges within this spectrum, what then is my work? Is also, you know, I mean, that's also what I'm tangling with, is like, okay, well, what is my work also given those realities? It doesn't mean that I don't experience my own anti-Black experience. I do. It's different from someone else's. And how do I find the connective tissues while also recognizing that there's distinctions between different people's experiences, and that Dancing While Black as a platform should also attend to that conversation. You know, this year we took a year off of the fellowship program. So there's been a fellowship program since 2015. There've been 22 fellows over the course of like 3 cohorts. And then we took a break to listen. And then we applied for some funding, but kind of in league with a white institution. We had to withdraw ourselves from the funding opportunity. So we haven't had the funding to restart the fellowship, but it allowed some space to kind of re-envision the fellowship as something that I'm now calling the North Star Arts Incubator. That's really about visioning. So the fellowship was about building network and community, particularly for young Black dance makers who are coming into a New York landscape, although a couple of the fellows have been from New Orleans in sort of my long-term alliance with New Orleans arts communities. But coming into an arts landscape, or coming of age in an arts landscape that would still have them. I mean, things have shifted since the time that Dancing While Black was formed. And I think there's a lot more appetite within white institutions to talk about equity. I mean, you know, I've got the diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is not language that's ever resonated with me, but it's a beginning, I guess, for some people. So North Star Arts Incubator is like, okay, but beyond that, because Black and brown artists and queer artists and women artists are beyond diversity, equity, inclusion. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'll say, is for the white institutions to get their shit together, or to start to get their shit together, because that language still centers the whiteness.
Yeah, and it's an otherness. Yeah,
it is.
Yeah.
So I'm like, who are the people trying to create liberation practices within the field? And why do we need to continually center whiteness within that activity? And so we're working to kind of support cohorting around idea generation and also resource accumulation toward emerging visions or ongoing visions about how that work happens, and where that work happens. Like, I think it's problematic that New York is so central in the arts and dance landscape. Because it implies that in your own communities that many of us come from, that we can't do excellent work, and excellent by whose standards?
Right.
And that our own communities, you know, like I'm from a small town surrounded by water in the Caribbean Sea. And in our home communities, you know, even I grew up dancing and thinking, oh, I'm going to go to New York and go to Fame High School. That's what I used to think of it as, Fame High School. And So that was internalized messaging that I had gotten,
Right.
even though my teachers were like idols to me.
Right.
But still, my goal was to leave my home space and go somewhere else in order to fulfill my dream for myself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I also am a person who's benefited from 16 years in the New York landscape. So it's, these things are complex, like my critiques are complex. I'm not really that interested in the touring model or the presenting in theater space model. Like my work hasn't typically tangled with that impulse. And at the same time, I benefited from 6 years of touring with a major dance company, and that like I grew during that time, and that some people are interested in that, and that as a young person I benefited from Alien Dance Theater of Harlem coming to my tiny little island and performing and like amplifying my sense of like what I could do or be. So I feel like for me, some of what the North Star Arts Incubator and myself are looking at is like, how do we look at these complex critiques or questions and vision or re-envision or call back into the space things that maybe our ancestors knew or the folks who we call mentors know, and create something that has meaning beyond the kind of racist structures that we are contending with all the time, including the ways in which those racist structures have been internalized in our own thinking about our self-worth and well, I'll say our self-worth. That's actually that could be a period.
I'm interested to hear how you were able to work through those as a young adult, wanting to go to New York and experience all those things, and then coming to realizing that, whoa, I can do much more than this, and I can do much more for maybe for your culture, for your heritage.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say a few things. For me, I think it was helpful that I had such a strong early experience of affirmation. Like those first 10 years where people in my community saw me as a dancer, even though I didn't start formally dancing until I was maybe 7 or 8, but even in that short time, like I was so sort of affirmed in that identity and also pushed with great love in that identity. Like, okay, well, you want to be a dancer? You better work. Like, this is not some easy breezy thing that you're just like, oh, I'm good at that. And then to leave that with great excitement, like to leave and say, oh, I'm so excited. I'm going to go to the States and like, really do it. And be met with something that I wouldn't have been able to articulate at the time, but that now feels quite clear to me, like to be met with measures of potential that did not have me or my people or, my experience in mind, and to kind of like have to dim that light over time, like just keep dimming it. And, so I became quite adaptive. Like we moved quite a bit in that time. And I got to see a lot of this place. Like we lived in Hawaii, and then we lived in Northern California. We lived in Southern Illinois. We lived in Florida. So I got to see a lot of different territories of this place. And I released that identity to a certain extent. Like I was like, oh, I mean, as a young person, it was as simple as like, oh, I can't do the splits anymore, so I can't be a dancer. Like that's how this shit works. It's like, okay,
I mean, I've heard many dancers think that or value
yeah.
their dancing ability based off of their flexibility.
Yeah, which is one measure of virtuosity, but we'll talk about virtuosity in a second. And then, so I'd given up that identity, went to undergrad at Florida A&M University. And then many things happened. Like I discovered a Black dance community that spanned, Dr. Beverly Barber, who shepherded dance there for decades, like created with no program, a Black dance community that spanned from like West African dance to like ballet to super experimental, like Black centered work. I'd never seen all of this stuff together before. And I didn't know that all of that stuff was like, I mean, I knew African dance was Black but I didn't know all of that stuff was Black and together and could all be together. And so that set a certain kind of new expectation, or like, let me cross a certain threshold. But still I was like, yeah, but you can't, I mean, like, you can dance with this college company, but it's not like you can dance. And then I interviewed Jawole and realized that the stuff I was doing as a journalist, which was like, get more voices in the paper, tell more stories from a Black-centered perspective as I can. And then dance, which was still this small little ember that was like burning in my gut. She really like, I mean, she blew my mind by saying, by like, I spent an afternoon with her interviewing her, and then I held that. Like, that was like this tiny little seed. So I'll say those are several of the things that set me up, I feel like, to come to New York. There's so many more people to name, but to come to New York, at the age of 30 in the hopes of dancing for a company. So I went and pursued journalism, started dancing with a company on the side that was founded by a guy named Michael Metcalf, Cleveland Contemporary Dance Company. I was a founding member of this company. It was dancing, like, I like to call it was like Superman, not because I think I'm a superhero or whatever, but I was like at the newspaper by day and then dancing at night. And eventually I realized eventually the thought descended on me. And this is where listening, I feel like constantly listening, like listening internally and externally, and then also trying to discern in as much as we can, like, we're just people, but trying to discern in as much as we can, what of the messages I'm listening to are intended to feed my potential, and what of the messages I'm listening to are things that I've internalized that I think are my own thoughts, but that aren't really intended to serve me or the people I care about.
Right.
Or the people who I'm in a lineage of, or the people who will come after me. And that takes practice, and you don't do it right every time. So I feel like there's a way in which having all these myriad experiences, leaving the newspaper and going back to graduate school in a place where, I mean, somebody might call you up and be like, well, that history is not correct, but this is the history I know in my body as far back as anyone can tell me. Like, I don't know a Black person who graduated with an MFA from that program, like, before me. And so to contend with, at the moment of like where I'm starting to seed the great potential by going back to grad school and telling myself, listen, you need to be doing this all the time. And this is the transition for you. And to contend with the ways in which racism and whiteness and white aesthetic culture played into my experience of that place, and the way in which that allowed me to exercise both resistance and vision was a helpful setup for coming to New York. So then I moved, that was a 3-year program. And then I moved to New York in the hopes of working for Urban Bushwomen. And a year later, they had an audition for one person. And I just fought. Like, I was the oldest person in the audition, or at least by the time we got to the final sort of 12 or 15. Yeah, it's like a week-long audition. And I knew why I was there in a very particular way. And so I guess what I'll say is that, like, having this, what I like to call a North Star, which is why North Star Arts Incubator, which is a nod to like what I think of as the visionary Black choreography of the Underground Railroad. Like, people who choreographed the Underground Railroad believed in a vision that was like beyond their lifetime. And I'm not saying like, I mean, that's a lineage that I feel connected to. And I'm not saying, the work I'm doing is the Underground Railroad. I wouldn't be so presumptuous.
Mm-hmm.
But that is such an inspiring story of visioning to me. Not just of escaping, but of visioning something beyond this moment. And that has been something that stuck with me over and over time. Like, if you set something, I never thought I would move to New York and work for Urban Bush Women. But I said it as like, it's a possibility. Like, it could, I don't know, like, in setting it as a like, that's something I never think I would do, but would I love to do that? Yes. And so knowing, at least being able to identify with authenticity and humility, like, that's something I would love to do. And I don't know if I'll ever get to do that, but I think that would be meaningful and life-changing and affirming in ways that I can't even yet imagine. That kind, having a North Star, a guiding thing that's beyond my reach, or at least I think is beyond my reach, has been a really good way to set my compass to try to discern what's worth putting energy into and what's not. Because there is so much, both intentionally and unintentionally, out there to distract us from our purpose.
Right.
Yeah. Paloma, so I have this burning question, and unfortunately it's our mini series, so I want to make sure that we get it in today.
Okay.
So we've been talking about companies and wine companies and how there's so many who've come out recently in letters and acts of solidarity. And I feel torn about it because obviously we're waiting to hear from some companies who haven't spoken out, like, where's your statement? But at the same time, like, we're also not interested in people just trying to save face and not making any changes. So do you have any advice to these companies who truly do want to change and be more inclusive, who are putting out statements about change? And since you've been doing this work and we don't have to start from scratch, what advice do you have for those companies who are saying that they want to be in solidarity with Black lives?
The first thing I would say is follow the lead of Black people and people of color. Like, the impulse to do something at this moment, which is quite a popular impulse. Maybe 5 years ago, not so popular. 10 years ago, not so popular. You know, in 2012, to say dancing while Black and Blackness is at the center was not like, that wasn't something that was happening in the field. And so the idea of looking, I mean, this is an ahistorical culture and racism feeds that. So shedding, like, using their privilege and platforms to shine light on the work that's already been done by people of color, channeling resources toward work that's already been being done by Black people and people of color, pausing and listening. Like, this pausing is pausing to listen, not pausing out of paralysis. Pausing is not like witnessing, let's call it witnessing.
Right.
Which is like something that was a huge part of my experience in Urban Bush Women as an artist. Like, the art of witnessing on stage is quite an active practice. And so I'm not suggesting they should witness as a performance, let's be clear, but witnessing as a practice so that you will know, you will be in the witnessing. There is a great likelihood you will learn what to do next. That's how it happens choreographically, in the vast Black improvisation traditions that I've been grateful to, like, connect with, that witnessing can lead you to the action. So being in a rush to just do shit.
Right.
Thank you. So we have a section called our Flash 4 portion, where we ask all of our guests to answer 4 questions as fast as they can. Are you ready?
Let's see.
Let's go. So if you had to recommend a resource to our audience, what would it be?
Wow. Right now feels crazy about that. But I'll say something that's really guiding me at this moment I feel like Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown is something that everybody should be taking a look at, this book, because of the ways in which it illuminates generations long practices of how to be in the emergent. And we're in the emergent all the time. It's just we hold on to the fixity of some things, but how to be in the emergent and what's the great wisdom that already exists around being in this moment. So I would say Emergent Strategy.
Gotcha. What was the first dance you saw?
Oh, wow. So I can't remember because I'm from the Caribbean. So I've been at parades since before I have memory. But I will say seeing Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater at Island Center, which is an outdoor theater in St. Croix, as like maybe a 7 or 8-year-old, it's an outdoor theater, like where when the sound comes on, bats fly at the stage because it's the Caribbean, there's bats, really was life-changing. I mean, I had a little autograph book and I went back and I was like, I'm a dancer, and they signed autographs.
That's so cool.
Yeah, so I was like, oh, these people are big time, and they came, for them to come down at that time, we were talking the 80s, was really impactful.
Question number 3. Do you think social media has a positive influence on the dance world? Yes or no?
Yes or no. I'm Gemini, so I'm always like, maybe. I am a self-proclaimed Luddite. I'm decent. Like, I learn things as I need to, but I'm not I'm not the one who does any of the social media that Angela's Pulse does. I just learned our login for Instagram when the pandemic happened. So I was like, oh, I don't want to do Instagram. I really would have to say it depends on who you ask and how you're using it. It depends on who you ask and how you're using it. What I will say is that for my comrades in the disability justice movement, that dance's sudden realization that online platforms, we could make this class accessible for all of our people, because now we all have to deal with the inaccessibility of dance, has been really important for me to listen to and learn. I'm just at my growing edge of understanding, but I know myself to be that what I'm fighting for and what folks who would advocate in the disability justice movement are fighting for are aligned and often intersecting in people's very bodies, who I would call comrades. So in that way, maybe if I have to give yes or no, in that way I would say yes, in recognition of that, the way in which that's been illuminated for me as an able-bodied person.
And final question, what is your favorite social media platform?
Come on, yeah. The front porch.
The front porch? Okay. I like
the
that.
Front porch is my favorite social
love that
platform.
That's a new one I haven't heard.
Particularly the front porch in the Caribbean. I can get more specific, but the front porch broadly. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank
you so much, Paloma.
How can people get in contact? How can people donate? How can they follow you? Because you're already doing the work. Let's get people the resources they need.
Yeah. So our website, angelaspulse.org, ANGELASPULSE.org, has information about the projects we're working on, about who the team is, about a bit about our history and also how to donate. Like right now, we're really looking at how we can collect resources to redistribute again toward work that's contending with this moment, that has been ongoing, and also that is emergent. And there's a network of folks connected to Angelus Pulse who are ready and activating work. And I would love to be able to channel resources in their direction just to support that ongoing work. I'll also say that, you know, one-off donations are totally welcome right now. And if Angelus Pulse's work looks like something that you feel like you want to invest in, that like having, you know, monthly donations, I'm typically not very good at all of this around donations, but this moment, because we're like such a redistributor of resources, feels important to say like, oh, if we know people are making monthly donations, that's building a relationship with this work over time. Like that's about creating a long-term commitment. And for me, building community over time is the foundation of my practice as an artist and an organizer. And resourcing this work is also about building community. And I have to even wrap my mind more around how that's a part of community building, as a person who's been reluctant to sort of ask for support. So
I'm gonna throw a curveball real quick.
Please.
Before we actually, and I know it's a short series, but I've been dying to ask this because we're all educators. But if you had any advice to give to the Black young dance community, what would it be? Especially with changes that need to be changed, fights that have been fought. What is it that you would give them?
Are you talking about like college, or like when you say young, do you have a particular?
I think all the young, I mean, maybe college, young ones just getting started.
Great. I'll pass on first advice that was given to me at Jacob's Pillow Dance Festival. I gathered with a bunch of artists from around the country to study with Catherine Dunham just a couple years before she passed away. And we were told there every day we had to hug each other at the beginning of our day, hug every single person in the class. And then we were constantly told to do our work. And it really stuck with me. And so this idea of like listening to your own voice about your work, you know, dance is a field where you can get a lot of messages from the outside about things that you have to be doing, that you're expected to activate all of these visions that come from the outside. You're expected to internalize them and then activate them in the right way. And that's so much of our training. And that training has been valuable for me in some way. And there are messages in my body that might contradict some of those messages. And so I feel like rather than dimming your own internal messages, like ask yourself questions about them, about how whatever messages you're getting from the inside or outside might be pushing you more toward your purpose. So that's, I guess, one thing I'll say about the work. And then I'll say, and maybe this gets to the social media thing too, I feel like we're in a moment of great possibility in terms of like young people as what folks call like native to all these different platforms. And so while those of us who didn't come up with these platforms, we didn't grow up with these platforms, but we're now kind of trying to figure out how to use them in order to adapt in this moment. I think there's actually there's some visionary work that is yet to be done by folks who have a facility with these technologies in order to vision things that are quite deeply felt and experiential and not transactional. And I'm excited for that. Last night, I saw Urban Bushwomen actually had open rehearsal, and some of the things they were doing inside, like the new leadership in Urban Bushwomen was doing inside of the platform of Zoom, was quite inspiring. And so, and that was rehearsal. So I'm so curious about what, in particular, like Black and brown and indigenous and queer folks have to bring to this moment. Yeah.
Awesome.
That's
Thank
y'all's
you
work.
so much.
Thank you.
It was such a pleasure, and I needed to hear it, and I'm ready to get the change going.
Yeah, let's keep being in this conversation. I'm really excited about the work that you're doing and kind of the way you're visioning, like you're visioning a platform. I'm excited that my vision gets to intersect with yours, and also that I get to see the ways in which yours pushes and grows and pushes me to think about things in ways that I haven't before. So that's what we gotta be. We gotta be in the conversation, and not just when it's like, yeah, rah, let's do it. But like, I have a question for you right now. So thank you for that, for asking questions.
Thanks for taking your time to tune into Dance Behind the Screen, a bi-monthly interview series where we go behind the screen to question process, product, and social media. Be sure to follow us on social media at KNOW Box Dance. See you next time, and don't forget to say no to the box.